When we think of war crimes, the usual suspects' names will come up: Mussolini, Pol Pot, Slobodan Milosevic, Hideki Tojo, and of course, the list of hundreds of Nazis, including Adolf Hitler. Second only to the Nazis on the list of war criminals is the list of Japanese Imperial Army soldiers and officers during World War II. Yet one man's name is conspicuously left off that list: Emperor Hirohito of Japan. Welcome to Intrigued Mind and our video on Hirohito, the man who escaped being charged with war crimes. Before we jump into today's video, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Most of the aforementioned war criminals were either detained or died before justice was served. Yet, Hirohito escaped a trial and went on to live a life of luxury for 44 years after the surrender of Japan. How and why did this happen? And why do some researchers believe that this may be one of the greatest miscarriages of justice the world has ever seen? After Emperor Hirohito proclaimed Japan's surrender to the Allies on August 15, 1945, many people sincerely hoped he would be prosecuted as a Class A war criminal for crimes against humanity. However, this never happened. Throughout the post-war decades, Hirohito depicted himself as a helpless emperor who had no influence over the conduct of his military. Academics have debated the matter, with many believing that he was innocent. However, many experts in the modern era say that he did have a significant role in Japan's involvement in World War II and that he should have been punished for war crimes. After all, he was their godlike leader. Who was Hirohito? What was his role in the atrocities perpetrated by his troops? And how did he get off scot-free? Michinomiya Hirohito was born on April 29, 1901 in Tokyo. He was the first son of Crown Prince Yoshihito, who subsequently became Emperor Taisho. Hirohito, who completed his education in Japan, was a microbiologist who later acquired an interest in marine biology. In 1921, Hirohito traveled to Europe and was the first Japanese crown prince to travel internationally. After his return to Japan, Hirohito's father took early retirement due to a mental condition. As a result, Hirohito was given the title of Prince Regent, a position that gave him the authority to run his father's affairs in his place. Following his father's death in 1926, Hirohito became Emperor of Japan at the age of 25. As emperor, Hirohito was seen as a manifestation of a god and hence the nation's greatest spiritual authority, a belief embraced by the Japanese of their emperors since 1868. He was also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. When Hirohito became emperor in 1926, Japan was in the middle of a violent and chaotic time, which is ironic considering that his reign was given the name Showa, which means bright peace or enlightened harmony. A pro-democracy movement had just formed in Japan, but militarism was also on the rise. The economy was in disarray, and China and Japan were at war. This Sino-Japanese rivalry resulted in two significant Japanese atrocities: the Manchurian Incident and the Nanking Massacre. The Manchurian Incident was a false flag operation orchestrated by Japanese military forces to justify their invasion of Manchuria in 1931. On September 18, 1931, a lieutenant of the Japanese army detonated a small amount of dynamite on a South Manchuria Railway Company railway line in Mukden. The Japanese army accused Chinese dissidents of the crime and retaliated with a military invasion that led to the conquest of Manchuria. 6 months later, Japan formed Manchukuo as its puppet state. The scope and magnitude of war crimes committed during this occupation were horrifying. In Manchuria, Japanese special military forces experimented on civilians and POWs. Unit 731 was one of the most notorious. Without anesthetic, victims were subjected to vivisection and used, among other things, to test biological weapons. Between 3,000 and 12,000 men, women, and children perished during Unit 731's human experiments. Numerous fatalities were also caused by the use of forced labor by the Japanese military. Historians have found evidence that more than 10 million Chinese people were forced to work in Manchukuo, with a resultant death toll unknown. In 2007, Reiji Yoshida suggested in a Japan Times story that Japanese investments in Manchukuo were partially supported by narcotics trafficking. After the war, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal reached a similar conclusion, stating, quote, "Japan's real purpose in engaging drug traffic was far more sinister than even the debauchery of Chinese people. Japan, having signed and ratified the Opium Conventions, was bound not to engage in drug traffic. But she found in the alleged but false independence of Manchukuo a convenient opportunity to carry on drug trafficking and cast the guilt upon that puppet state. In 1937, it was pointed out that 90% of all illicit white drugs in the world were of Japanese origin. Although this behavior could simply be put down to the military doing as they pleased without their commander-in-chief's permission, Some historians think otherwise. According to them, the use of chemical weapons in China was authorized by Emperor Hirohito. In addition, tens of thousands and maybe as many as 200,000 Chinese perished of bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, and other illnesses as a consequence of biological testing and warfare. Even though there is no record of chemical or biological weapons in Manchukuo due to the deliberate destruction of documents by the Japanese, these weapons of mass destruction were partially developed, created, and stored in Manchukuo with Hirohito's knowledge. The war crimes in Manchukuo were horrifying, but nothing compared to the depravity of the Rape of Nanking in 1937. The Rape of Nanking was the mass execution of Chinese people in the capital of the Republic of China. The slaughter began in December 1937 and continued for 6 weeks. War crimes perpetrated by the Japanese included mass rape, looting, and arson. On December 13, 1937, Japanese forces entered the city with minimal opposition. The killings started that same day, with Japanese forces operating unimpeded. In contravention of the rules of engagement, Chinese troops were summarily executed. Women and girls were raped in mind-blowing numbers, and rampant looting occurred. Estimates of the death toll range from 40,000 to more than 300,000, with rape cases ranging from 20,000 to more than 80,000. Did Hirohito know that this massacre would happen? On August 5, 1937, Emperor Hirohito granted the final sanction for the slaughter and crimes perpetrated during the invasion of China by approving the Japanese army's proposal to eliminate the limits of international law for the treatment of Chinese detainees. This ratification meant there were no codified rules of engagement, and the Japanese army was allowed to perpetrate widespread rape and murder of both civilians and military personnel. These crimes were committed before World War II even began, and the Japanese were just getting started. In 1940, Japan joined World War II. They did this by signing the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, which made them part of the Axis. Some historians believe that Hirohito was only slightly involved, if at all, in decisions made by his military. They also point out the fact that Hirohito preferred diplomacy over fighting in World War II. However, he did sign the agreement to bind Japan with Germany and Italy. Hirohito blessed the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the war. Moreover, he ran a war room in the Imperial Palace, sometimes dictated orders to his military commanders, and awarded a service medal to Dr. Shiro Ishii, whose medical experimentation team during the war was as gruesome as that of Joseph Mengele, the infamous Nazi angel of death. While the attack on Pearl Harbor and the opening years of war with the US were generally successful, after the loss at the Battle of Midway, Japan started losing its initial wartime gains and was on the back foot. Towards the end of the war, Japan's military leaders were willing to commit national suicide in case the Allies invaded the main islands of Japan. In the end, Emperor Hirohito, who was in charge of the army, was the only one who could get the military to surrender. This saved the lives of what was estimated to be over 1 million Allied soldiers and 140,000 prisoners of war that Japan had planned to murder if they were attacked. In August of 1945, it seemed likely that Hirohito would be prosecuted as a Class A war criminal. The fact that this did not occur is nearly entirely attributable to General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was designated Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers by President Truman and served as Japan's leader for the next 5 years. It seems that MacArthur came to Japan with the preconceived notion that Hirohito must be allowed to live as normal. He disregarded the reality that the emperor was not a powerless constitutional monarch, but rather wielded ultimate authority with an army and navy that directly reported to him. He thought that the emperor was so important to the Japanese way of thinking that without him, the country would be impossible to govern. It was also in the best interest of the United States for Japan to become a stronghold of democracy against communism. Japan was surrounded by communist countries like China and the Soviet Union, so Japan would be a stronghold of democracy against communism in the Far East. So, Hirohito was left alone. A post-war constitution was drafted that maintained the monarchy, but made the status of emperor symbolic. The concept of the emperor as a god was abolished, and elected representatives were granted political authority. In addition, American authorities began rebranding Hirohito as a paragon of peace and democracy. According to many, this decision essentially exonerated the country of responsibility for these atrocities and created a lack of remorse for Japan's World War II crimes. Emperor Hirohito died in 1989, leaving behind a horrific legacy, and essentially got the world's biggest get-out-of-jail-free card ever. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.